I have also Nasser Yassin. He's the interim director at the Issam Faris Institute. He's an associate professor. For policy and planning at the Health Management and Policy Department for Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB. And I have Bilal Saab. Bilal used to be a Pentagon officer, and he's now a senior fellow and a founding director of the Defense and Security Program for the Middle East Institute in DC. So now, during our webinar, we will have the view from Lebanon, we will have the view from Paris, and we'll have the view from DC. We will have 1 hour of discussion, 1 hour and 10 minutes of discussion, then we will open the floor for your Q&A. Nasser, I will start with you. I will start with Renda. Hello, Renda.
Can you see me?
Yes. Hi, Renda.
Hi, hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Renda, you know, the explosion, everything was like kind of calm in Beirut. The situation was really bad. The currency was deteriorating, but everyone was leaving Lebanon alone. Under the pretext, do the reform and we'll come to your help. Then the explosion happened, and we saw France being the first country to run to help Lebanon. The president himself came. How did the explosion change or affect Macron's policy towards Lebanon?
Look, it did not really affect it because there's a big, there's a long time relation between France and Lebanon. And the public opinion in France is very much engaged and really interested in what's happening in Lebanon. But the explosion, of course, was such a big thing on Lebanon that prompted Macron to decide to really go to visit. He was due to visit on the 1st of September for the 100 years anniversary of the Grand Liban anyway. But this explosion really quickened his visit, and of course he was very shaken because also his entourage is very much linked to Lebanon. Even his advisor, his chief advisor, was ambassador to Lebanon. He even studied in Lebanon and in Syria as ambassador. He was the former ambassador to Lebanon. And he has friends who are very close friends to him. There's a banker, Samir Assaf, who came with him on the plane. And he's really engaged because France is engaged and because it's a tradition. Remember François Mitterrand, when the Drakkar explosion happened, he was he came to visit the injured, and he came to the blast, the place of the blast. Chirac also came when Rafik Hariri was assassinated. So it's really a French tradition. When big things happen in Lebanon, unfortunately, they're really bad, big things, then the French president decided to come.
Okay. He said something. He threw many buzzwords. He threw the word, change. He threw the word. But the word that intrigued everyone is new political contract. And he said new political contract, unity government. What does a new political contract mean?
I think that basically the national unity he spoke of was not at all the national unity that you and me think about Lebanon. He thought that he wanted, this is what they explained after, the Élysée explained, and he himself explained, that he wanted a government largely inclusive of all voices among the people and among those who are requiring and demanding change. That is basically what he meant. He didn't mean that he wanted national unity of traditional political parties, because he knows that this won't work out. He knows, he saw the people, he saw their shouting in Gemazi. We were with him when people were cursing all the political class. So he realized that this country needed a change. Not only him, but before him, the Minister of Foreign Affairs came twice actually to tell the people, to tell the government that you need to reform, you need to help yourself so we can help you, because they never thought that the Diab government was a successful one. From the beginning, they knew that it was not an independent government and it was a flop. So they gave him a chance, and he didn't take the chance because he was politically totally linked to Hezbollah and to Aoun.
Okay. So what you mean, unity government, he doesn't mean the traditional parties, Hezbollah, Amal, Lebanese forces, the Progressive Party. He mean with them also the civil movement that's now in Beirut. That's
Yeah,
running. Yeah.
he said it. He was very clear about it. He said that we want a government that we wish. I'm the president of France, he said, and I'm not going to pick up the government for Lebanon, but I really wish that it would be a government that is very inclusive with all the voices of the people in Lebanon. And of course, I mean, political, probably some political, I don't know. I mean, if some political voices would join the government, I don't know. But I think that he really meant inclusive government.
Okay. So what do you mean? I mean, he said the unity government, it's an inclusive government that represents everyone, not only people in power, but people who are not in power to be empowered. But what he meant when he said a new political contract also. So unity government, but also a political contract. Does he want a change in the structure of the political structure in the country?
Look, Dania, I think that they are thinking about something I don't know of, but I think that they are he's probably thinking about a new electoral law, a real change. But I don't think he had something specific in mind. As far as I know, well, I discussed with his entourage. I think that they're still thinking with Lebanese people and with people who know about maybe to find something of a change, but I don't see how they can change with Hezbollah. This is my own view. It's not his view. But because when I asked him about Hezbollah, he said, I have no solution. I asked him in the press conference, I said, what about Hezbollah, which is the main problem of Lebanon, I think. This is my own view. He said he didn't have a solution, and he did not bring Hezbollah to the parliament and to the government since 15 years. They've been here. He was not responsible for that, but he said we have to talk, we have to think about. He did not specify about his this contract you're talking about, and he mentioned, I think they're thinking about something I don't know.
Okay, because he said, where does Hezbollah and Iran stand in his policy? You said he doesn't know, he didn't elect, but obviously he's liaising because he called Rouhani and told him, please minimize your interference. So where does Hezbollah and Iran, I mean, does he plan to influence Iran maybe? Does he plan to liaise with Iran? We know,
Yes,
I mean...
yeah. I think that, as soon as he got back from Beirut, he called President Trump, and he asked him to release a bit the pressure on Lebanon and the isolation of Lebanon. He asked him to re-engage in Lebanon. He said that if you desert Lebanon, if you desert Lebanon and you leave it to because of Hezbollah and Iran, then you're playing into their game, and you're giving the country to their influence to Iran and Hezbollah. But he also asked Trump to release the pressure and to diffuse this pressure on Hezbollah and on Lebanon.
Hmm.
Why? Because I think he thinks that he can still convince the Iranians to accept, to tell their agent in Lebanon, Hezbollah, that uh, stay aside of an independent mission government, and, and let this government do the reforms so you save the country. I think that this is an impossible mission, but I sincerely wish he could succeed. But my own opinion is that he never succeeded with the Iranians, but every single French president who came tried to uh, to do a mediation with this Iranian regime. They're really they deal like the bazaris, They want to do they want to take a lot and give a little. But now they only have Lebanon, and I don't see how they will give way to an independent government. Anyway, Nasrallah said it the other day in his speech. He said, "We do not see any independent or any. There is no such thing as a neutral government," he said in his speech. So I don't know if it's a bargaining position or it's his final position. It might be a bargaining position, but it might be also final position.
He also threatens of a civil war, which is like a really a no-no for all Lebanese, because the ghost of the civil war still haunts every house and every citizen and
Yeah,
every family.
he actually addressed his own people when he said, "Please retain your anger to later. You might use it.
We might need it.
Yeah, you might need it and you might use it," he said.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what you think about that Macron, still in goodwill, wants to engage with Iran, thinking it might have a positive role to play in Lebanon and to engage with Hezbollah. And this is something we will talk more about it with Bilal about how is the U.S. response. But I want to continue with you, Renda. Where does Lebanon fits as part of France's policy towards the region? I mean, France is now engaging more, is very much engaged in the region. How does Lebanon fits in this whole big puzzle, like this piece of Lebanon?
You
What
know,
is
traditionally and historically, if you see what the relation between Lebanon and France, it has always been a very tight relation, even within the civil society, within not only on a political level, between the Christians and the French. It was always is a very historical uh, relation. But I think that, of course, France also has interests in the relation with Lebanon, because if you look at the whole region, I think the only country that is that makes that has let's say that where France has an impact and even the Americans coordinate with the French on Lebanon, is Lebanon. If you take Syria, there is no more influence of France.
Mm.
It's Russia and Turkey. If you take Iraq, it's mainly the U.S. Although France is trying to have a slight bigger impact. If you take the Gulf, also it's not France, although it has excellent relations with Gulf countries, but still, I think Lebanon is mainly the key country where France has an impact and influence to play in the Middle East. And don't forget that in Lebanon there are a lot of players. So France can play a role of mediators. They try anyway with the Iranians, with the Saudis, with they have leverage to be able to have this role, this impact in the region through Lebanon.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Macron, I mean, how does the approach, the outreach to Lebanon, affects Macron domestically? Does it give him any gains? We know that Macron lost the municipal elections big time. So is the approach to Lebanon supposed to boost him domestically?
It does.
Will it affect it?
Look, it does somehow. Pictures and his videos and the films of him going in Gemazi with the injured people and seeing destroyed places had really an impact. Now, from now till the next election, it will have time to change unless something else happens. It does play some kind of influence on his image internally, but it is definitely not the real game change in his image, because it's the economic situation of the country that will definitely be the most important thing internally for the French people. But certainly, Lebanon is his trip and his visit was viewed very positively in France. I know from the press, from the pictures, from the videos, from the comments. Of course, his political opponents, they always find something to say against it, but mainly it was a successful visit, I think, from the point of view of the internal public opinion.
Thank you, Renda. My last question for you, how do you see the French policy towards Lebanon going from here? Do you think it's just now they will help with or you'll have more engagement on the long run? How is it going from here?
Look, I think they will have an engagement. I don't know how long it will be. It all depends. I mean, now the conference of the aid conference was very important. He did have the assistance and the coordination with the U.S. is very important. David Hale called Emmanuel Barn, who is the advisor of the president, the chief advisor of the president, before and after his trip to Lebanon. They always coordinate. They always talk. Um, I think that the French will remain engaged. How successful he will be, it all depends on the political class. Will they allow enable a government that will do the reforms, that will save the country? I don't know. I have my doubts, but I think that French will try and try and try. How successful they will be, I don't know. My view is that Hezbollah will be the main obstacle that is really difficult to get rid of this obstacle. And I can't see Lebanon moving forward with this party uh, still dominating the political scene.
Thank you, Renda. Thank you, Renda, for a very valuable input. Thank you very much. Now we move to our next speaker, Nasser Yassin. Nasser?
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, how are you? Nasser, I want to ask you, you're based in Beirut, and you watched the movement, the protest movement from 17 October to build up, and it built up momentum. You had huge protests. Then somehow you had the new government, and then you had the corona with the lockdown, and then it started to fizzle out. The Hirak started becoming small Hiraks, several mini Hiraks on several small issues. And now with the explosion, you have a new momentum. I don't know if it's a new momentum. I want you to tell me how the explosion affected the dynamic of the Hirak, of the civil protest movement.
I mean, just to put things in context, before the Beirut blast, before this big catastrophe, this crime, as a matter of fact, the country has been going in this deep economic crisis. I think colleagues, economists here who are watching us or participating know this quite well. The twin deficit that the country has been going through in its balance of payment, in its inability to finance its spending, and of course, even going into a banking crisis. All of these crises and deficits were also paralleled by, if I can call them, another twin deficit or deficiencies taking place in Lebanon. One at the level of the political class to come up with solutions. So we really were going in a political crisis, and we've been witnessing how the way the government and the political class or those in power were dealing with the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the banking crisis. It was really very clear that they're unable to come up with any solution. And parallel to this, the other deficit or deficiency was also happening at the level of the new political movements, if I can call them, or the revolutionary groups, or the activists that emerged from the October 17th movement. The 17th October movement and the groups that emerged out of it were also going in the inability to come up with new tools, new ways to affect the change or really lead to any change. Apart from the resignation of the Hariri government after a few weeks from the movement in October 17th, we were unable, or the movements were unable, to create any real change. So the paralysis was also double in terms of the government or the political elites and class and those who are in the new opposition groups. Now, the corona affected this. The economic crisis also affected its way to fizzle, but also, and more importantly, the tools that have been used, and they were again kind of used again after the Beirut explosion, are becoming ineffective. You need to think of different ways, and those ways need to challenge those in power and challenge the authority and those in government, rather than just go into the streets every now and then. Now, why is this? I think it has to do with the inability to bring in a wide coalition of groups together. Actually, maybe bringing almost everyone, and the inability to create leadership out of these groups, or a joint leadership to come up with very clear demands and to be able to mobilize the streets for those demands. I think we ended in, as you mentioned, Dania, doing many uprisings here and there, and that was quite good for the government, because this is a way of venting people's anger and people's anger from the policies and from inability to come up with solution in these mini Iraqs, as you call them. Now, after the Beirut explosion, we saw people's anger again, and groups were following this anger, and that's key here to keep in mind. That's always been people going to the streets naturally and organically, and the more organized groups following rather than the way around, rather the other way around. So I think what we need to look at is the ability of those groups to influence people's mood and people's behavior, which, in my opinion, has been limited so far.
Do you think because now we are in a state of emergency, partial state of emergency, because the government is still in control, though it's a caretaker government, it's not the army. But they are going to enforce a new lockdown. Do you think the new lockdown will diffuse a little bit the momentum of the protest now that it will affect, or you think this time the momentum will be sustained more?
No, I think the momentum has been lost. Honestly, I have to be frank with everybody. I think the momentum has been lost already. What we saw 10 days ago, the first Saturday after this explosion, this crime, if I can call it, was people's anger, and we've just followed, and everyone followed people's mood into the streets, rather than the ability of those groups to come up with real movement. I think, and this is a self critique, as a matter of fact. So I have to be harsh. I have to be honest. I think the ability for the new political groups to enact change in this piecemeal way and using the same tools, I think, is ineffective. And there's a need to change the modus operandi of the new political groups. One of the deficiencies here among the political groups, or the new political groups, if I can call them, is the ability, is the actually stopping the movement at mini gains or minor gains, like what happened with Hariri's government resigning. Everything stopped or started to slow down. And then similarly now with Hassan Diab government resigning, things also slowed down. Whereas the mobilization and the protest movement should continue in its active engagement and active movement on the streets or in other ways to fight the whole political structure in the country. If we want to build a new social contract, as a lot of the protest groups are calling for, and President Macron only used what the Lebanese have been saying, as a matter of fact. So this wasn't his lingo, actually. It's well documented that we really need a new social contract. If they really mean that, they need to continue hammering those in power rather than stop at the first juncture and be satisfied with it. And this is not happening. So there is no real movement against the whole structure, against the asking parliamentarians to resign, whether actually pushing the president of republic to bring in concessions or real concessions here, or get the movement into something real and something meaningful rather than the mini Hiraks you mentioned them, Daniel. So I think, in my opinion, it's not only about the corona and the lockdown. It's about the inability of those protest movements and the groups who organize many of these movements to come up with something meaningful in terms of the tools as well as the aims or the objective of the movement. Sorry, I'm being harsh. I mean, we're all part of this, but we have to put in.
No, we have to be honest and direct.
Honest about what's going on, rather than build false hopes, as many times we've been doing.
Well, now, so I understand from you that the Iraq doesn't really have a viable, ready alternative to the ruling elite. The ruling elite, President Aoun said the explosion has broke the siege on Lebanon, because before the explosion, everyone telling Lebanon, as I said in the beginning, you do reforms, then we come and help you. And as Renda pointed out, it's almost impossible with this power structure to have any reforms. And now humanitarian aid is flocking to the country. I mean, tons and tons of aid. Everyone is sending us aid. Bangladesh sent Lebanon aid. So how is the ruling class dealing with humanitarian aid? Because they're the government. Are they using it to reposition themselves, to create more leverage where with their traditional, with their base? How are they using the humanitarian aid?
Okay, I mean, this is, I think, a very good and serious question that deserves even another webinar at some point to do with you, Danny, and other colleagues. How we're going to look into the politics of aid and beyond that. But so far, the major aid hasn't come. Whatever has been coming so far is the immediate assistance and immediate aid relief for the affected communities. But definitely, the political class in Lebanon live on crises and disasters. This has been the case since the 80s. You know, they really know how to utilize crises, whether at the regional level or at the national level, in order to maintain their grip on power. And they saw many of them this unfortunate incident and crime and huge explosion. Unfortunately, they saw it as an opportunity, and I think it was mentioned by some of the speeches that this is an opportunity to engage with the international community. And what would contribute to this opportunity is, the inability to do any of the real reconstruction without engaging with the government. So whatever the international community and donors are pledging that this aid is going to go through non-state actors is superficial and populist and is not real, because you need to go through the government, whether local or central government, to undertake such reconstruction and such rehabilitation and such recovery. So definitely those in power want and are looking to ways to utilize the coming aid to rebrand themselves, or to, as you mentioned, leverage out of this to reappear as rebuilding the damaged and destroyed parts of Beirut and the country. Now, would people actually accept this? I think this is the essence of the issue. I don't think people of Beirut have any trust with those politicians. I think they would, and we've been seeing this on the streets. They've been, treating them very, very vocally and in action in a very bad way in terms of the way they dealt with some of the ministers or government officials who went to the streets. So would this be sustained and continued? I'm not sure, because the government and those in power have their ways to utilize the assistance and aid in a way to benefit their clients, as they've ever done since the 90s and on. So yes, they're going to leverage this, and they're very smart in using the coming aid to leverage their position and to feed into supporting their clients' networks. So the question, would the people accept this or not? I think this is the question that we need to discuss with people in the protest movement and in some of the new political groups, in a way that you need to monitor, you need to follow up, you need to make sure that the aid that's coming to Lebanon is not going to be utilized to political gain of the political class.
Okay. Another question, Nasser. Now the political class is trying to market itself to gain the compassion of the international community. Recently President Aoun, and he's from the axis of the resistance, said, we're ready to talk to Israel as long as we solve lingering issues. Israel was considered. So everyone thought of this as a stunt to get the compassion of the US, of the international community. So they seem really desperate to get acceptance. You have, for example, Hale came to Lebanon. He didn't meet with Jubran Basir. So how are they? You're based in Beirut, you're in contact with people. How do you see the ruling class, who lost all legitimacy with the people and with the international community, and it's very obvious they are incompetent and corrupt, how they are trying to make themselves relevant today? What's their message to the international community? How can they sell themselves to someone like Macron or Hale or Heiko Maas? What do they say? How can they appeal to these people? What are they trying to do? Based on what? How they can make themselves relevant?
I mean, I will not give a lot of weight to what the president said about in his interview with the French journalist. I think at some point these come up in not in a so thoughtful way, I guess. So I mean, all this that the president wants to talk to Israelis, I think sometimes it's been taken superficially. I don't think this is the issue. The issue is at the moment is the lack of trust that exists between the Lebanese populace and those in power. I think all of them, those who've been serving official positions or political positions even since the 80s. So I think this is the question: is how those in power are going to regenerate themselves as they regenerate the damaged and destroyed parts of Beirut and to regain legitimacy. I think this is the question that we need to keep asking ourselves in order to prevent using such aid and such assistance for those politicians to rebrand and regenerate themselves. And they're masters in this, by the way. I mean, we're already very weak in terms of asking for such thing to be different than before. But perhaps the lack of trust, people's now being more vocal, their anger, they're all going to help in terms of putting those people accountable and not accepting what they did in the reconstruction of the country since the 90s. Now, what do they offer to the international community? I mean, at some point, they offer their positions. As a matter of fact, when President Macron was in Beirut, he met the same people who've been in power. I mean, the Sultan. He met some of the people from the Hirak, from the groups. But for me, it was a symbolic meeting rather than anything else. When he met those representative of the major political groups around the table, this is when he asked them that you need to bring in a unity cabinet. This is when he asked them to need to come together and maybe bring in some flavor from the civil society. This is as shallow as it is, unfortunately. I mean, people in Lebanon were building high hopes on this, that Macron is bringing a lot of change. This is very superficial and very lightweight in terms of the thinking that President Macron is going to bring such change into the country. I mean, in the scene of it, as well as in the discussions that he held, it was really part of regenerating the same old power and the same old groups. This is the main meeting that he actually held, rather than asking for real change in the country. So this is what they offer. They offer their position, their power that they bring from their position, their ability to leverage their position, and so on, rather than anything else.
Okay, so Nasser, it's not very positive. We have a catch-22 here. The same time, you say the more there is aid that coming through these corrupt politicians, it will empower them. But at the same time, because they are in position of power, you cannot reconstruct, you cannot help by bypassing them. So we are here in a deadlock. So what do you suggest to the international community? I mean, you're very well connected with the different groups in Lebanon. You're you are a professor at AUB. What will be your recommendation to the international community? What should they do? What should they do in terms of aid, in terms of how should they push for the political process, and in terms for the investigation also? What should they ask for on these three fronts: aid,
Okay.
investigation, and political process?
Okay, we're going to take them one by one. In terms of aid, uh, first and foremost, it's very important to have representatives from the communities that were affected, real representatives, sitting on the table and being consulted to take the decisions when it comes to reconstructing their neighborhoods and businesses and so on. You need to do it. You need to do it in the right way, rather than to just rubber stamp the engagement of the citizens and the people. This is key. You need to bring on to the table the citizens, the community that were affected, but also civil society groups who are active in reconstruction or in monitoring or in advocacy to certain sectors, whether it's about the urban heritage or local economic recovery, and so on and so forth. So you need to bring them not symbolically, as it's been the case so far. I've been part of many processes where we sit around the table symbolically to represent civil society or academia or think tanks rather than be part of the decision-making process. And the international community has always been playing along this, playing along with the government rather than being very assertive in the need to bring in those voices around the table. This is the first lesson. It's very straightforward, very, very action oriented, rather than perhaps some people would criticize that we in academia just talk and don't give any solutions. This is a real solution where you can bring around the table those people and the representatives of the community as well as civil society to take the decisions rather than just sit there and listen. So this is number one. So of course you need to have the government here, but the government is not only politicians. There's a lot of
Civil
honest people in
servant.
the civil service. You can look for them. You need to empower them, bring in the civil service. Now, of course, many of the civil servants are there because they were put in by the politicians that protect them or brought them into there, and so on and so forth. But there are good elements in civil service that we need to bring forward. So it's a tripartite thing that needs to be established for the reconstruction of Beirut. Civil society, community, representative of community, of local business, and so on as one group, the government through the civil service as another group, and of course the donors, the international community. This is where the international community can leverage on the money that's bringing, on the aid to put to put this tripartite arrangement together. And so this is one way, perhaps, of doing it, and it's doable. I think we can do it. We can push for it, and this is where the protest movement and the new political groups can ask for it, can monitor, can advocate, for more transparency and more accountability. Now, the second point on the political process, right?
Yes.
I got carried by the reconstruction. So
Yeah,
in the political
process,
process,
then the investigation.
yeah. I mean, I'm and I link these together. I'm perhaps different from other colleagues here in Beirut. I don't want to rely a lot on the international actors to push for change. Perhaps you leverage on certain dynamics, but we're over relying on international actors and pushing for international powers to contribute to this. I mean, I don't want to sign a letter for President Macron to bring in change. It's actually my duty as a Lebanese citizen to go to the streets to make my concerns and my needs vocal and even be militant in whatever the law accepts this militancy in pushing for this reform and pushing for this change and pushing for accountability. I mean, the scene of having Macron and others and Haley, and I mean, this is again the same. We're falling into the same problems on relying on the international community to solve our problems. The international community or any international player is almost always operating by their own national interests. They care about Lebanon because they want to maintain a minimal level of stability in this country. And this is what they care about. And the minimum level of stability is because Lebanon is part of the neighborhood. It's not more, not less. All other talks about thinking of the international community are caring about Lebanon because they're so sympathetic and benevolent to Lebanon is shallow and simplistic. So we need to rely on ourselves. We need to build a real protest movement in Lebanon, a real civil society, a new political groups that can mobilize the community, mobilize their constituents, and gain legitimacy from that. This is where the change happens. It's not relying on others. So this is, and I will move directly into the point of the investigation. Yes, for an investigation that brings in some expertise, but I'm also not so keen on just going into superficially and knee-jerk like reaction to get international investigation. The international investigation would also play along the lines I'm mentioning around international actors having their own national interests in whatever they want to do. But of course, you need investigators, you need expertise, you need all other professionals from the north or the south, from east or west to contribute to this and know what exactly happened in the port of Beirut. But it's also an opportunity for us in Lebanon to push for the independence of the judiciary. I mean, again, I've been fighting for the independence of the Lebanese judiciary forever, and the protest movement has mentioned this as one of the key issues that we need to gain in Lebanon, to get the judiciary in Lebanon to be independent from politicians. And now we have the crime of the century, we have this huge collective it's crime that's destroyed parts of the city and displaced a lot of people from Beirut. This is where you need the judiciary to act, and you go and run for international investigation. I find it schizophrenic from many Lebanese actors who are seeking this. I know this is may not, some of my colleagues may not like this opinion, but this is being honest about it. This is the moment where the Lebanese civil society, where the Lebanese protest movement, where every independent voice in Lebanon needs to go and fight for an independent judiciary in Lebanon, and to make it accountable and to make it professional in this investigation. How to do that? You do that through some of the lawyers who they call themselves the revolution lawyers, who've been doing fantastic job. They can be part of this investigation. They can make a case, and they can, of course, there's also the judges club who can be part of this. This is the moment where you can push for an independent, and very professional investigation in Lebanon, with the support of some of the international investigators, particularly when they need and require technology and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser Yassin. Thank you very much for your input. Now I move to Bilal. Bilal, I want to continue with you where I stopped with Renda. And Renda said that Macron and the French are liaising very closely with the Americans. And we saw it in the news that President Macron called President Trump and asked him to relieve some sanctions on Hezbollah. Do you think the American will listen to the French? I mean, we see that Makinski is on the way. That's what they say. Do you think the French have a leverage over the Americans? They can change their policy, because we see maximum pressure policy going ahead.
Can you hear me, Daniel?
Yes.
If this were a session in Congress, I would say I will yield my time to Mr. Yassin, because he's just making too much sense, and really appreciated all the comments that he just made. Let me start by saying there's a lot in this speaking engagement that I find very special to me. Obviously, I'm talking about, as a Lebanese American, I'm talking about my beloved homeland. And it's also a discussion that is hosted by my alma mater, that's AUB. And I wish this were happening under different and more hopeful circumstances. Nevertheless, it's such a privilege to be with you, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the friendship. I appreciate the scholarship, from which I learn a great deal. You asked me about U.S. policy. Let me try to cover some basics. And obviously, I'm not going to claim I have answers to much of this. Before the blast, I'd say that U.S. policy was pretty simple and maybe consistent. You, Lebanese government, reform, then we'll pay attention, and we'll deliver the goods and try to help you with the IMF. There was no specific ask, if I recall, of Hezbollah not being part of the government, being part of the government. I don't think there's any specific mention of that prior to the blast, as long as the government, of course, committed to implementing serious reforms. And I make that observation on the basis of what Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said several months ago. Now, I'm not so sure that this, let's call it, formula still stands today, let's say post-August 4th. I think that U.S. officials, I hope at least, they realized, and I think Randa has mentioned it before, and maybe Nasser too, I think they realized that the ruling class is simply incapable of reforming. And no matter how many times you tell them to do that, and for reasons, of course, I'm not going to get into, because you guys have covered that pretty well. So to wait for them to reform was a non-starter. I think the policy was too passive, and by any objective standard, I think it wasn't working. So what happened on August 4th obviously was not an ordinary event, and the sheer calamity of the explosion forced the Americans to reconsider. And the U.S. response had to be, in many ways, commensurate with the size and the significance of the event. Now, this process of readjustment, I think, has just started, which is why I don't have many answers as far as U.S. policy. So I don't know all the elements of this readjustment process in terms of thinking, at least. And as a consequence of that, I don't know if it's going to work. right? So let me try to talk about that for a moment, this readjustment. And I think Nasser has mentioned it, any conversation about US policy toward Lebanon or any other country must start with interests. This is where it all starts. And for now, the number one interest of the Americans in Lebanon is to try to prevent Lebanon from becoming a failed state. That's the bottom line at this point. This is the minimalist objective. You might have some preferences. Frankly, you're not in a position right now to have those preferences if you are Washington. Your number one interest is to try to prevent the country from completely falling apart. Because as Nasser said, it is related to many other interests that we care about in the region, be it the great power competition, be it the issue of terrorism, you name it. But a failed state, another failed state in the region, is simply something that the United States will try to prevent to the extent possible. Okay, so how do you do that, right? Well, first of all, this requires knowing what or who has gotten us to this place, right? This very miserable place that we're in, where both politics and economics have completely collapsed. The problem is that this collapse is collective. There's no one actor in Lebanon that has caused this collapse. I think it's all of the country's leaders, it's all of the country's sects. So it is a collective failure. That said, I want to emphasize this, that said, there is this one actor that has played a larger role than anybody else in contributing to this collapse, and there's no question it's Hezbollah. Okay, so if you are Washington and your number one nemesis in the country, which is Hezbollah, is a culprit in a lot of what's going on right now, how do you sort of dent its influence? How do you reduce its influence without jeopardizing your number one interest, which is the prevention of having another failed state in the country? I mean, this is the ultimate challenge. This is the million-dollar question of U.S. policy right now. How do you balance between reducing the influence of Hezbollah, and at the same time not shooting yourself in the foot, and contributing yourself now to the return to arms, to the return of civil war in the country, from which obviously you do not benefit? This reprogramming in U.S. policy, which has just started, like I said, requires some serious thought, okay, some serious thinking, and there could not be a worse time for that in Washington right now. Everybody is extremely busy with the number one event, which is the presidential elections. I don't think there's a whole lot of bandwidth really for major diplomatic initiatives in foreign policy. Now, you might challenge me and say, well, Trump administration just came up with a major milestone in the Middle East as far as the agreement between the UAE and Israel, right? Well, that has been in the works for a long time. So at least a couple of years. And you just saw the fruit of it very recently. On Lebanon, they literally are just starting right now to reconfigure how do they think about the country. And that's going to take some time. And it's not going to happen over the next few months. It's just that simple. They're that busy. I'll add one more challenge, which is that I don't think Team America is thinking really on Lebanon in the same way, or they're on the same page. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think that the State Department is now, I think in many respects, unified and has the same voice on Lebanon right now. I think Mike Pompeo just last week delivered his instructions to the team. David Hale was to visit first. That visit is over now. Next is Dave Schenker. I believe it's going to be this week, and delivered the same exact message, which is push for the reforms, maybe try to come up with an independent technocratic government that would oversee this transition. And who knows, maybe at least start the conversation, because I think either Nasser or Randa mentioned it before, start the conversation about a new electoral law, which obviously is easier said than done, because the current one that we have took probably a year and a half to 2 years to satisfy all the sects, including the Christians and the Muslims. So to come up with a new one right now, as valuable as that might be, it's extremely challenging. But at least start that conversation as the new government undergoes the very necessary reforms. I think that the Pentagon and the State Department, at least parts of the Pentagon now, because there's been a change recently in terms of who's leading the Middle East portfolio. Let's just say overall, these two institutions are speaking similarly as far as Lebanon is concerned. I wish I could say the same about the White House. Whatever sentiment, whatever voices that came out of the White House in recent years, at least when I was in the Pentagon, regarding suspending or even terminating the assistance to the Lebanese army, those sentiments, those voices still exist. And in many ways contributing to a divided policy, US policy towards Lebanon. I don't know how that entire reorganization is going to happen, like I said, over the next few months. I think this is an ultimate challenge for US policy here. First, fix your house, and then actually go and try to deliver a coherent policy towards Lebanon. And it just so happens that this is also a country that is extremely complex, and I think that is beyond the nuances of US officials, quite frankly, to come up with really a new major diplomatic initiative. And this is where I agree with Randa. If the French are not ready yet for something like this, I don't think the Americans are either. So what are we going to do? We're going to do what we always do, which is muddle through, essentially. Try to prevent the worst. Try to prevent the worst by doing three things. We're going to keep providing humanitarian aid. Okay, I don't think that's going to be something that's going to stop. I don't think that's going to be conditional. Of course, is it perfect? No, it's going to have to be challenged through some sources that somehow have some kind of connection to the ruling class, but that is the reality of things. I think the Americans are going to try to do as much as they can to try to circumvent the political class, but boy, is that going to be challenging, because those guys are like an octopus. They have a hand everywhere, pretty much. We're going to try to maintain the same levels of support for the army, despite those voices coming out of the White House and probably also some sectors in Congress. The third thing that they're going to try to do, like I said, is to try to push, at least in conversations, for this technocratic, independent government. And this is where we're going to face the biggest challenges, because the one actor that is completely against that, as Randa has mentioned before, is Hezbollah. There's no mincing of words here. The speech of the Secretary General is pretty clear. There is no way they're going to be supporting something like this. They are perfectly fine with the return of the former Prime Minister Saad Hariri to the premiership. That, of course, would be a slap to the face of many people in the street, whatever the street means. But I would bet that a lot of people would be unhappy with that. They would be unhappy with the what you call the national unity government. But this is what Hezbollah is going to be pushing for. And I don't know what kind of leverage we can use. I don't know what kind of pressure we can apply to try to force an independent government in Beirut in a way that does not lead to further tensions in the country and Hezbollah lashing out, essentially. And who knows what would happen in the streets in terms of violence and what have you. I'm 100% in agreement with Nasser as far as this, as attractive as it sounds, this international package that will come from Lebanon, right? That there is some kind of close liaising between the Americans and the French on Lebanon, and that would be the key ingredient, the key variable to rescue the country. As easy it is for me to say that sitting here, but there is no substitute for change coming from within. Now, of course, you can get some help from the outside, just like what happened in 2005, if you recall, where there was sort of a mixing of domestic agitation, domestic movement that received a lot of support from the international community, of course, Washington, after the assassination of Hariri. Right now, it's a much more complicated picture. There is no unity in Lebanon as far as the protest movement, as far as organization of the protest movement. There is no, lack of a better word, of a constituency through which the international community can work. That's what is so complicated, and that's what's so different from last time around. Let me stop here. I know that you probably have other questions. I can't hear you, Danya. You're still muted.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you now. Go ahead. Nope, you're back to muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, I just want to ask you about the technocratic government, because they see of it as the beginning for a change. Hezbollah and Amal said no to Nawaf Islam. Do you think there will be some formula that might be accepted? Because otherwise they will bring someone else like Hassan Diab a university professor, a doctor, and they'll say, here you go, this is our technocrat, you know? Do you think there is like a figure, someone or that can be acceptable both to the people in power and to the international community, mainly the US? Like someone who would be accepted by both as a starting point?
I feel like I have exhausted my forecasting skills when I picked several years ago Tamam Slam to head the cabinet. Everybody ridiculed me at the time. Like, there's no chance he's going to head it. And actually, it turned out he was going to be the guy. This time around, I have no clue, to be honest.
I have no clue.
No,
Okay.
I mean, this is a question for Nasser, really. But I don't think that the Americans are really going to be that much involved in the details of it, really. I think that the consistent message is going to be, as long as you commit to serious reforms, and as long as you at least pretend that Hezbollah is not dominating the process, then we're going to be okay with that. In terms of personalities, I don't think we're pushing for anybody, quite frankly. I don't think that they're that involved in the most intricate details of the formation of the next cabinet.
You spoke about the LAF, Lebanese Armed Forces, and you said there are voices that wants to reduce the aid. There was recently a report by members of the Republican Party in the Congress who advised a 20% cut of the aid, and there was a fight between the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon. A while ago, they wanted to block $105 million. So how do you see the position of the LAF? You know, the LAF is under a lot of pressure. At the same time, and especially now with the state of emergency. So it's a state of emergency, but it's not quite of a state of emergency because they are still in power and they call the shots. But it's the army who has to keep people at home and arrest people and tell them not to protest. So how do you see the position of the LAF and how do you see the international community looks at it? I mean, the US, let's see. Because the US, the most number one support for the LAF comes from the US.
You're exactly right. Look, the Lebanese army is in a almost impossible position here. You know, on the one hand, they must, and they know they have to, respect the rights of the people to peacefully demonstrate. Otherwise, you know, there will be consequences. And as you said yourself, Dania, some from Washington, the number one sponsor of the army. And I think we're tracking this very, very closely in terms of behavior on the ground, in terms of policies. And I wish that those concerns coming out of Congress would be a little bit less politically motivated and more coherent, but that's a conversation for later. On the other hand, so yes, for allowing the protesters to peacefully demonstrate. On the other hand, which is where I said that they're in an impossible position, they can't allow the protesters to occupy government buildings. It's that simple. Their job is to prevent violence in the streets. And that's part of the Constitution, right? Their job coded, like I said, in the Constitution is to safeguard civil peace. Now, a lot of people have asked, well, look, it's about time that this institution take a historic stand and side with the protesters. I'm sorry.
That's what everyone is saying. That's what everyone is saying.
Well, look, I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the Lebanese army. You have to remember this is an institution that is a reflection of Lebanese society. They have members from all sects, and they have a pretty difficult history in terms of maintaining cohesion, in terms of maintaining discipline, and they don't want to repeat the experiences of what happened, as you very well know, in 1976, when it completely collapsed a year after the Civil War. They have to stay as far away as possible from politics. And right now, they're operating without, you have to remember this, they're operating without any semblance of authority in the country. The government has collapsed. Okay, caretaker government, that's fine, but there is no political authority in the country. We have to remember this is an institution that doesn't operate independently. They are subservient, they are responsive to the wishes of the Council of Ministers. There is no Council of Ministers today. There is no government in Lebanon today. So this is not Egypt. This is not Pakistan. We don't have a military-dominated regime in Lebanon. This is an organization that is begging for civilian guidance that doesn't exist. And let's be very clear and frank. I mean, I want to echo Nasser's frank comments. There is no alternative that the street is presenting that is credible. Let's just say I'm an officer in the army. Let's just say I'm Joseph Aoun right now. And I'm hearing those wishes, I'm hearing those calls for the army siding with the protesters. What street are we talking about? Am I going to give up everything as an institution and side with a street that is A, divided, B, disorganized, and doesn't offer me protection? No, I'm not going to do that. It is jumping into the unknown. If I'm an organization that is going to make such a historic stand, by the way, assuming that they can, okay, politically speaking, they can't, but just assuming that they will. Why would they do that? They're jumping into the unknown. There is no credible alternative that can offer them protection, and they're not going to lose that. They can easily lose themselves by doing that. Of course, morally speaking, a lot of people want them to do that, but there's no way in hell they could do that and maintain their cohesion, maintain the semblance of an institution that is working to try to prevent civil peace. So, look. I don't think this organization can risk everything, including its own unity, by taking a very morally praiseworthy position, but at the same time that really does not reflect the current very difficult political reality in the country.
Yeah, it's also some, let's say, if what the protester asks siding with the people, this can lead to divisions and lead, you know, in 76 the army, as you said, defected, and it was divided. It can lead to civil war. If so
who knows, this organization is going to be asked to also I don't know, for the next few weeks and next few months to pretty much preside over politics, should there be an arrangement where they're allowed to do that. They're not going to make that decision themselves. But if there is some kind of an international consensus supported by an internal consensus, which I doubt that Hezbollah would be happy with, but let's just assume that for 2 seconds. The moment that they're going to be put in that position is when they have to basically no longer take sides, which they're not right now. But they cannot take sides right now if at least there's a prospect of them playing a bigger role politically speaking. They have to stay as neutral as possible, as far away as from politics as possible.
Well, we have one instance in 48, Bashar al-Khoury, when there were riots. He put the head of the army, Fuad Shihab, as a prime minister, and then Fuad Shihab later on, oversaw elections, and then it brought Camille Chamoun. So there is a precedent where the situation, it's an emergency where the president can put the head of the army as a prime minister, but that it happened once. Anyway, I want to end with you, Bilal. I want to ask you, what's the prospect of a U.S. policy in case of a Biden presidency? Now in 2.5 months, we might have a new tenant in the White House. So do you think Biden will have a different policy? Because now we have the maximum pressure on Lebanon, on Hezbollah, sanction on Hezbollah, Caesar Act, Magnitsky. Do you think this will change with Biden? He will be more engaged. He will have less sanction. What do you think? I mean, how will a Democratic president will? I mean, Biden said he will go back to the nuclear deal, which means he will be more soft on Iran, so hence more soft on Hezbollah. So what do you think in general the Biden presidency will mean?
Well, the Biden campaign has been quite active lately, messaging, communicating to Arab Americans, to Lebanese Americans specifically, how they would approach Lebanon differently. But I think we all know that there's not going to be a ton of difference, frankly, between the current approach and then if there should be a new administration come November. There might be one significant difference, but that's potential, which is, I think, what you have alluded to, Danya, which is the policy towards a bigger country that obviously has a ton of influence over Lebanon, which is Iran. The concern is, and I think it's legitimate, is that should the Biden administration go back to this approach of negotiating with the Iranians, right, returning to the Iran nuclear deal, reestablishing rapprochement, or whatever term you want to use. Lebanese are concerned, understandably, and a lot of people in the region, not just the Lebanese, they're concerned about how such a process would, in many ways, affect the interests of the Lebanese and the very influence of Hezbollah, right? Because the number one concern then was that you're going through this conversation with the Iranians about the nuclear issue without really addressing the regional stuff. And everybody you talk to here from the campaign, they'll say, well, now we'll rectify that mistake. We will have a comprehensive conversation with them, and we will address the regional issues. Okay, well, that's going to take years. Obviously, that's not going to happen.
It didn't work
overnight.
with Obama. Sorry,
Well,
it didn't work with Obama. The
right.
grand deal, the grand bargain didn't work with Obama.
Well, I'm not exactly sure that was part of the equation then, even though they did mention it. But I think the number one priority at the time was the nuclear deal. And whether they ran out of time or ran out of bandwidth to address the other stuff, I don't know. But if there is going to be a new Democratic administration, the hope is, I'm just going to describe it as hope. The hope is that they would learn from the mistakes of the past, and that they would not jeopardize, processes in Lebanon and in other places, or security interests of their partners, just to start this conversation with the Iranians. So I think it's way too premature, really, to judge at this point how they're going to react, should they be in power. But all the messaging that we've been receiving from the campaign, because they're organizing, they're doing task forces, they're having conversations with the communities, is that we're going to do this differently, but of course change has to come from within. Don't expect too much for the United States, which frankly I agree with. That's what Nasser said. I agree with Nasser.
Thank you. Now we have 15 minutes for questions. I want to start. We can't take all the questions. We'll have to take only a few. I will start with Professor Bernhard Trottner from the German Development Institute, and he's asking about displaced people from Beirut and how much they add to the Syrian refugee, because obviously now you have more displaced people. How many displaced people you have because of the explosion, and when can they expect it to go back to their homes, and when are they expected to go back to their homes, and where are they expected to take refuge?
I'll answer briefly, Dania. Okay. I think we're still looking for the assessments that are taking place. Yes, 2 weeks now, and we haven't got a real figure about the assessments, telling a lot about what's happening and the inefficiency among many groups, government as well as international organizations. But we know that there are around 80,000 houses that were damaged. Now, those who are on around the north, I think most of them have been displaced because they're severely and some of them totally damaged. So, up to my knowledge, anecdotally, and I've been following some of the assessments that are ongoing at the moment, I think most of them are relying on family support and their social network to live somewhere or move. I haven't seen a formal response to get those who were displaced because of the blast into some kind of accommodation. I haven't seen this. Mostly done as many things happening now and have been happening historically in Lebanon, relying on their social network and their family arrangements and so on. Now, what would happen? I think many of the groups are supporting in clearing the rubble and in providing like plastic sheets and some basic assistance at the moment until the aid money starts to flow in. And I think we will have to wait for many weeks, I guess, to get the money in, and particularly to get in a plan to reconstruct and rehabilitate the damaged house. I think it takes time. I hope we come up with a process that can facilitate this before winter is in. But just to give you, to put in context to Dr. Bernhard, the Nahr al-Bared Palestinian camp in Lebanon was destroyed in 2007. And so that's like 13 years ago. And there were also some money coming aid to the government and to UNRWA and to other actors. And so far, this hasn't been concluded. Maybe small parts of the camp have been reconstructed, but by and large, this hasn't been done. That's 13 years ago. So you can imagine the inefficiency in Lebanon around this. So I hope the citizen engagement and people's engagement would make this process go faster. So let's see how things evolve in the next few weeks.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm mute. Sorry. The second question is to Bilal, directed to Bilal, and it is having warships sent to Lebanon, French warships sent to Lebanon, and also having, we have the FBI who's sending people. You have a French forensic. You see picture of soldiers, were fully equipped soldier coming on Lebanese soil. So what is the message the international community is sending through this move? What do they want to say? Why are they sending soldier on Lebanese soil? Can you answer this, Bilal, please? We don't hear you. We don't hear you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Well, talk about a strategic mistake. I don't know who was handling strategic communications before they sent these warships, before you saw all that military personnel, but certainly if I were in charge, this would have been the last thing I would do. I would avoid this like the plague because it sends the absolute worst message. Why would you need to send these warships? I don't understand. Frankly, there's a lot of posturing here, obviously. Some of it is understandable. I get it. You want to, take the lead as far as showing what kind of resources and leverage you can muster, but that is the absolute worst message that you want to send to that country, which cannot absorb that kind of military pressure and military competition with others. I understand why it's done. Frankly, that visit by the French president in the streets of Beirut would have been sufficient. I don't understand why you need to send all sorts of messages through your defense minister to do that. Notice that the United States hasn't done that. Of course, the FBI is on the ground, but that is purely for investigative reasons. I think that, in many ways, Hezbollah is not happy with that, obviously. But recall that also after the blast in 2004 and following the assassination of Hariri, also the FBI was on the ground, but I don't think Hezbollah was that concerned about it at the time. But this would not be the kind of messaging that I would be pushing for. Way too militarized a foreign policy, which has been a trend, I would say, in U.S. foreign policy overall. I think that needs to tone down significantly should there be a new administration. I don't think it will tone down if Trump were to be reelected for another 4 years. But hey, we had the same problem here. I mean, look at the military presence in the streets of Washington when there have been demonstrations and protests across the country, not just Washington, right? You saw the military on the ground. And of course, we had to tone that down later. But the absolute worst kind of messaging. And I don't know what's behind it, frankly. I don't think there's a whole ton behind it beyond just, a show of muscles, a show of competition amongst nations over whatever, leverage they want to gain in Lebanon and, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you, Bilal. The other question is from Ms. Basna Abdel Khali. How do you see, and also to Bilal, if you would like to comment on this, how do you see the role of the Lebanese institution in the post-disaster era? Which objective shall be observed and which mechanism to put in place?
Lebanese institution?
Yes, in the Lebanese institution. I mean, Nasser spoke about the judiciary. Maybe you can both give an input. Nasser, maybe what the Lebanese should do, and maybe you, Bilal, what's the international community should enforce on Lebanon institution? Like, maybe better oversight, maybe more due diligence on the Ministry of Finance. I don't know. It's up to you to answer. So
Probably a Nasser question first and foremost.
okay, Nasser.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a good question, very good point. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that we need to have independent, assertive, confident judiciary in Lebanon. I think this is key for the post reconstruction process, as well as for a lot of the reforms that have been delayed in Lebanon. This is the cornerstone of any reform, is to get independent judiciary. I've been focusing on this, but I think this is key in Lebanon to move into fighting corruption, inefficiency, state capture, and so on and so forth. So this is key. Now, for this particular case of reconstructing Beirut or the parts of Beirut, particularly Ashrafiyeh, you need to have more and more citizen engagement in the process. You need to get them to see and know and have all the process transparent, including the subcontracting process that's going to take place, to be sure about all the bills, all the costs, and so on and so forth. This is where it will be a showcase of transparency and of real governance, good governance of the reconstruction process. Of course, historically, this hasn't been the case in Lebanon. Reconstruction process is always done in less transparent ways, benefiting the elites and their cronies. So maybe this is now a test for such demands for more accountability. And this is where we need to empower civil society, citizens, communities that were affected, with the support of international donors.
Dania, can I add a comment? I can't hear you, but I think you said yes. Okay.
Said yes.
Look, Lebanese institutions don't operate in a political vacuum, obviously. And I don't think that it is really fair to expect a whole lot from a state that is completely shattered at this point, and all its institutions, to deliver on such a massive effort without, while shielding itself from the influence of the politicians, right? I mean, I think there has to be a political process first and foremost. I don't know what shape that political process would take, but once that kickstarts, then the institutions can function at a more, at a higher level, at a better capacity. Completely shielding this from the politicians and the ruling class virtually is impossible. And this is where Nasser's comments are so pertinent, because this is when you rely the most on civil society. This is when you rely the most on the private sector. And Lebanon has had a history of, a private sector playing a very important role in the affairs of the country. So I think this is where you lean on the most, the civil society and the private sector, pending, of course, a political process that allows those institutions to function again, because they cannot function without that process kickstarting, at least.
So you mean starting bottom up, starting on the local level?
Both. It's bottom up and top down. It's that simple. This is the only way that it's going to work effectively. You cannot just expect this to be sustainable by pursuing one approach at the bottom up. There's no way it can deliver, because look, the calamity of the event is so huge and the destruction is so huge. This cannot be left on the shoulders of civil society and the private sector. There has to be state support, except that the state is completely shattered. And so there's got to be a political process. If politics are not moving forward somehow, even at a 5% level, those state institutions cannot be activated. It's that simple, including the judiciary that Nasser is talking about.
Yeah, but the point is, what's the starting point? You know, you say government of technocrat, but the people in power will not accept someone from technocrat. We said that the Iraq or the civic movement is not ready. It's not well organized. It's divided. It's not mature enough. So what is the starting point? Who is the primary mover for this whole process? How can you, I mean, some people are talking about chapter 7, like in Bosnia, in Yugoslavia, like in Rwanda, where, the United Nations comes and takes over the country. And I don't think it will happen. I think people who say that don't understand international affairs. But I mean, what's the starting point? What's the solution? What's the solution?
I mean, I'd love to hear from Nasser, but I'll just say very briefly, this conversation that's going on, whether through the streets, whether it's behind closed doors, obviously that we're not privy to, this conversation about what the next steps is happening, for sure. I don't think that there is complete immobility at this point. Whether that leads to the preferences of the street is something else. I think that there's going to be another government that probably is going to bring back the same people. That is not what anybody
so we're
wants to
back to
hear.
square one.
Right. That's not what anybody wants to hear, but this is part of the conversation. This is a negotiation that's taking place right now. It's just the process of contentious politics. I don't think that the desires and the wishes and the aspirations are going to be met at any point soon. But we're going to go back to some kind of a, call it national unity government or what have you, but you're going to see the same faces back to government to reactivate, as I said, those state institutions so that they can at least play a little bit more of an effective role, minimum role exactly, in this rebuilding process. I wish it were a different case, but that's what we have. That reflects reality. And because the number one actor that stands to gain the most from this is Hezbollah, and it happens to be the most powerful one.
So you don't think there is a change, there is a possibility of a change, and the international community will accept that, will accept a unity government?
Well, you tell me whether they really have the leverage to force their wishes on the Lebanese people. I mean, what is the history of international powers, as powerful as they are, to force their wishes on smaller countries? This is not a unique situation. You're going to see that over and over again.
And Nasser, do you think now, like, the people will accept the same faces in a new government? The same people, will they accept it? After all what they've been through, after the currency going 80%, after the fact they can't withdraw their money from the banks, after the fact that there is trash in the street, after the fact that there is no electricity, no nothing, they will still accept that and say, okay, and they will swallow it?
I don't think so. I think people are very angry of what happened in Beirut. And that was what we saw last Saturday or the weekend before, when tens of thousands of people were in the streets. So I don't think it's going to go and pass as if nothing has happened, and for the political class to be back to business as usual. I think there are going to be some major changes, but no one would predict or can predict the mood of the street, if I can say it. I think it operates by the way they perceive the things in the country. Like we were expecting for when the currency was falling and collapsing, to have the protest movement to be revived again, but this didn't happen. So people were perhaps caring about their survival. They wanted to know if they got the food or some money and so on to keep going. So, but the challenge here, the key challenge here, is to mobilize people for change in the ballot box. This is what we need to work on. But of course, you need to have a law that can be as optimal as possible, to use this medical term, to get people to vote without any gerrymandering and designing the districts, to manage the process of election in a very transparent and a very democratic way. This is what we need to work on, and to ensure that this would happen. Again, this is where the civil society, the new political groups, and everyone can put on their demands In addition, as I mentioned, to the judiciary and its independence, you need to have a proper electoral law that provides opportunities for everybody to be managed in a democratic and transparent way. And this is where the new political groups can show their legitimacy and their actual engagement with the people, rather than now be more elitist or small groups here and there, as you called them early on, the mini hierarchies here and there. This is again one of the major challenges that we need to work on, with the support of international actors, to leverage on the aid that's coming to Lebanon. That's something we need to work on. And again, I don't see any other way, to be honest. I think just going to the street in mass movement happened in few instances in the past 10 months, but this cannot be sustained. And this tool, as a tool of engaging with the political class, can be countered in a way, and many ways. Going in violently and in a militant way also won't actually get to the results that people want. You need to organize those new political groups to gain as many as possible seats in the coming election, whether it's in 2 years or less, or earlier if possible, or maybe after. But that's something we need to work on, and that would be the challenge for the coming years.
Thank you, Nasser. Thank you, Bilal. Thank you, Renda. It was a really very insightful session. Thank you very much. I wish we could end it on a more positive note. And thank you for our audience for staying with us and for giving us your time. And thank you, Aysam Faris, for this webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Dania, for such great moderation. Thank you.